Because I've heard, especially with petrol stations and stuff, it can be...
Well, everything is contaminated. I mean...
Hello everyone, welcome back to the Hedge Talks YouTube channel. Now let's talk about hidden costs in developments. Now, you buy a buy-to-let, the kind of hidden cost is really, you take the wallpaper off, what's behind it. Really, that's the kind of biggest hidden cost that I think we would find in buy-to-let land. Obviously with developments, you have a pile of mud, a pile of rubble, and it magically becomes a house. Obviously that magic step is, it takes a long time, a lot of work, a lot of money. But what are some of the hidden costs that people should be aware of if it's maybe their first development that isn't going to be on the advert or isn't even going to be just mentioned, stuff that you don't maybe see or smell?
Yeah, I mean, what a hidden cost can be, or initially, is contamination in the ground. So you're building off the ground. We spoke before about you take the house, you can build it anywhere. It's always the same cost. It's what you're sitting on. So what's in the ground? Because if it was, so this was a scaffold yard before, and so he just made a road out of rubble. In that rubble had like little bits of asbestos, and so what had happened is that's been tracked into the ground over a period of years, and it breaks up into really small little fibres. You can't even see it. So what you have to do as part of the planning permission, you've got to do a soil survey. So they request you to do that. So you have to get a soil engineer to come down, take samples of the soil, sends it off to the laboratory and says, okay, what is this made of?
And that's for every site, or where there's a question?
Every single site, yeah.
Okay.
Every site that hasn't been used for residential previously. So if you're doing more than one house, if you're knocking a bungalow down and putting another house on, you're probably okay. But any new developments, you always have to do that. It's you have to do it. So we found that here there was asbestos all over. It was riddled with asbestos. So we had loads of land we had to take away, and then you have to dig down. So it's where it's going to be in someone's garden, so where someone can come into contact with it. So if, like in the back garden where we're sitting here, they might decide to go and dig up and put some potatoes out there. They don't really want asbestos coming through their potatoes.
Probably not the best flavour. No.
wouldn't cook too well. So we have to dig down like 600 mil, put a barrier in there, and then bring in loads more soil.
Wow.
And it's really expensive to get rid of contaminated land as well. So you have to have a certificate, take it to a special dump. And then you have to have all the transport certificates.
And soil isn't cheap. Even just buying it for your own garden,
really
it's not cheap.
Yeah, really expensive and really difficult to get in as well. It's big lorries, big lumps of stuff you're moving around.
It's
so
a scale,
really expensive, every
it's £1,000 in one house, times it by 9, that's 9,000, and then that's and that's just something. And it's, these costs really do mount up, don't they? Yeah,
and also it's what the ground can, the bearing capacity of the ground. So they have to drill down like sort of 7 or 8 metres. To see what the full strata of the ground is, to see if the foundations are going to sit on it, so it's quite complicated.
And this is all before you've even put planning in, before you've even thought this.
Yeah, you could put planning in without doing that, and you can get permission, but then as part of the planning permission, then you get conditions, and the conditions say, right, before you build,
you must do this.
This is the stuff that we need to see,
And how do you factor in for that cost? Do you just have a contingency for land, contaminated land, on every budget, on everything?
Yeah, so from experience, we've got our numbers, so we know how much it's going to be. We'll visit the site, we'll have an idea, what was this made of? Is it likely to be? We're going to see another new site soon, and we know there's going to be asbestos there, so given what we've gone through here, we've got a rough idea of what we're going to build there. We know how much it's going to cost.
I mean, are there any types of contaminated land, maybe like a petrol station or something, that you just wouldn't touch because you're like, or not really, where you're like, this is going to cost too much, forget it?
Definitely wouldn't touch that, because what they have is they've got tanks underground, and tanks are put in there sort of, 50 years ago, they've probably been leaking.
Yeah. You
wouldn't know they've been leaking, but it's been leaching into the soil. As soon as you test it, it's going to cost an absolute fortune to clean up. So we wouldn't touch that.
And I guess we do have a different set of processes. I think where as a business, what we've done over the last sort of year or so is set up processes and ways of assessing these kind of things on sites before we take it too far. So we do have another site, not actually too far away from here at the moment, which we've decided to do the ground investigation works at cost up front, because we don't want to take it too far. So
before you've secured the property?
Well, we've sort of secured it, but ultimately, yes. It's sometimes you have to look at where the highest degree of a risk is, and then make sure that you can knock those out. So we will have like effectively a board meeting and just discuss the overall deal. And we, for example, we're talking a lot about contamination. Contamination is the biggest risk area on our risk register for that. So we've decided, well, let's pull forward that appraisal and let's get that work done, because if there's any chance of this falling over as a development, it's going to be that area, or that area. So what can we do to make sure that we mitigate all of those before we go too far into it? And that's, an example of the kind of process that we now adopt compared to,
And that's cash up front, you're spending that, there's no...
We are, and it's a balance. We talked about sort of risk reward. There are certain things that you have to do, but the most important thing is protect the downside.
Which you are.
So
spend a couple
whether or not exactly.
So we wouldn't do that every time, would we? So,
no.
So we, as AJ said, we've had a board meeting, we've all been to the site, we've had a look at it. Okay, we can see this as a risk. That's about £10,000 for getting that. Before we've even purchased the site, it's going to cost us 10 grand. Yeah. But if we don't do that,
I thought building surveyors are expensive, 400 quid.
Yeah. Well, obviously we've done our model. We know what we're going to earn from the site in the end.
Yes.
So that £10,000 is well covered.
But it could fall out of bed now.
Yeah. If that brings up something we're not expecting and tells us a really bad story, then it could be lost.
Or it could be a renegotiation.
Yeah,
depending on.
And there's lots of other factors in there. When we talk to contamination, landscaping is a thing that people often underestimate. It's very expensive.
Even your own garden is like, it costs money.
And it's a considerable thing that people tend not to. So Kevin will probably tell you the right term for this, but the stuff outside of the house, right? The peripherals and the roads and so all of these things, when you talk about hidden costs, I mean, they shouldn't really be hidden costs, and they're certainly not hidden for us the way we go about things now, but it can be tempting for some developers to just, think, how much does it cost to throw up a house? But that's never never the real cost. The costs are, actually, how do you get services? So the site that we're in at the moment, where does the waste go? Where does the electricity come from, right? Whose land do you need to come over in order to get that in here? How much is that going to cost?
Yeah.
So there's hundreds of different factors that you really need to take into account, depending on whether or not you're doing this properly. And all too often you do hear about developers who are saying, how much is it to build a house, right?
Per square foot.
That's per square foot.
Yeah.
And that just doesn't take into account. And from the land and planning side, in the earlier years, we used to take that approach, and that was always something that created conflict, because by the time we got to the development's like, well, no, you haven't taken into account the fact that we need a sewage treatment plant on
substation down the road.
Substation needs upgrade. All of these things. So now we do all of that actually much earlier in the planning phase.
Because there's a lot of infrastructure, I guess, that goes around. Yes, this is a house, bricks and mortar, but then all those layers you just mentioned go around.
It's 200 metres from the road all the way to the top of the site. They've had to run a gas line, which is like huge, it's like 100 mil, all the way from the bottom, all the way up to the top of the site. The electrics had to come 200 metres all the way up the site. BT's had to come from miles away to run the fibre all the way down here, because people want fibre, fast internet houses now. So that cost us £10,000 to get that in here, just to get it to the site, and then it's got to come 200 metres up the road again. So it's
There's a lot to think about, isn't there?
And we haven't even talked about the cost of finance yet, which is probably the biggest hidden cost.
We'll talk about in the next video the cost of finance. Wow. So when you analyse your deals, then I'm assuming you have like a 100-point checklist, or like you have to go through. So it's not just like back of a cigarette packet, right? Buying, refurb this. It's like, what about this? What about this? What about that? It takes time, right?
Well, it goes in layers actually, because when you say back of a fag pack or a napkin, we do that as well, but we do that right at the beginning. So obviously as a business we look at sites and we're very specific. We don't blanket send things, and we don't we do always do some form of appraisal before we even send a letter or go out to anyone or try and find a site. So even at that stage, we tend to have a very high level appraisal and understanding, and then we just go through different layers, don't we?
As it comes in this direction,
as
it's
it goes
more
from
detailed.
to
So I'm like, well, hold on, what about this? Because another one has got to make this happen now, and so it starts off with the headlines, but the headlines have been built up over years, haven't they? Like through going through developments. Now we've got the numbers, so now we know the headlines are reliable, so we know how to kind of put that together. But as it gets further over here, it has to go into more and more detail.
So from the kind of vision, the plan, the sections of how it's going to look into the reality of, well, hold on, what can we actually do?
Yeah.
What should we do?
Yeah.